Okay. I've been a pediatric physical therapist my entire career, which is more than 30 years. And I primarily worked in school districts, and I went back to get my DPT in 2006. And at the same time, I also got my PCS. And since that point in time, I've been co-teaching the pediatrics course at Upstate Medical University. This is the 8th year I've been co-teaching with Anne Marie Apt. So this is actually a presentation that I developed to present in the school system that I work in, because childhood obesity has become so prevalent. I actually did this a few years ago, and I've updated it because there's new research since then. But I'm sure everybody is well aware of the obesity epidemic in general, but it's not just adults; it's also children, and it's causing them to have many problems with health and psychosocial types of issues, as well as their learning. And there is definitely a link between learning in school and whether or not the child is the healthy weight or if they are obese. And I'm going to present to you some of those links that show the importance of maintaining an appropriate weight and being physically active and how that's related to cognitive skills. So the objectives are going to be that we are going to understand the serious impact of obesity on the child's overall health and well-being. I want to increase awareness of the link between their health and physical fitness and their ability to learn, and discuss the role schools and physical therapists can have in preventing childhood obesity or dealing with it. And so we're going to have an overview of obesity with incidence, prevalence, and etiology. I have a whole lot of statistics and maps, and hopefully it will be interesting information. I think you'll find it to be informative. Health implications, the link between student health and learning, and there is evidence for that, and the role of school in addressing and reversing this problem. Okay, so here we go. Evolution of man. It's not so pretty at the end here, where we have a very obese person carrying their supersized soda. And then, of course, we have children that are too large, very young, and the links that if you're having a problem with being overweight and obese in childhood, that there's a very high likelihood that you will also be overweight and obese as an adult. And we used to have Generation X, but now we have Generation XXXL. And another very pretty picture of obesity. Okay, so I have, starting out just 3 different years, just to show you a difference. Now, this is all about just adults, because there wasn't information on children until much more recently. And they didn't have a ton of information until at least the mid-'80s. And I'm going to go through all of the CDC maps that I am using for this presentation, but just a kind of an overview. So at the bottom, you can see what the colors mean. So we have the light blue and the medium blue on the map, and the ones that are white, there was no data from those states at that time. So we don't know where they were. Okay, so in 1990, the states were either less than 10% obese, or they were between 10 and 14% obese. In 1999, so 9 years later, we've had to add a color to the map. And not only that, we don't have any light. All of the states are now reporting, and we have a large section of the country that is now 20 to 24% obese. And then in 2008, we only have one state that's blue. Who knows which state that is? Who's good with geography? I did this with teachers, and they knew geography, and I actually gave them a prize for figuring this out. I had to cheat and have a map. Later on, I have a map that has the little initials for the states in there, but teachers knew the answer to this one. So does anybody know? Colorado. So they were the healthiest state in the nation. And the tendency is that the southern states and kind of the breadbasket states tend to be more obese. So now we have to go all the way up to that farthest level with more than 30% or 30% being obese in those states. And at that time, the most obese state was Mississippi. Okay, so I'm going to go through these relatively fast because I have many. So 1985, lots of states didn't have any data, and we're down in the lower numbers for obesity. Oh, what's happening here? Okay, and then 1986, 1987, we're starting to get more states that have data. Keep on going. You can see that we are starting to get heavier and heavier. We're in 1991 now, 92, 93, 94, 95, 96. 97, we have to start adding the greater than 20% obesity rate. And then we have 98, 99, 2000. Now we have Mississippi coming in at greater than 25% obesity rates. 2002, we have more states that are obese. We don't have any light blue or medium blue. It continues to get worse and worse and worse and worse. Colorado's hanging in there still as the most fit state. Well, whatever that is up there, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, something like that, whoever knows geography. We continue to get worse and worse. Now we're into 2009. Colorado still hangs in there at 15 to 19%. This one is a little bit blurry, but you can see that every state is at least 20 to 24% obese. This is a different scale, so the colors are different on this one, but this was the most recent one I could find. So again, we have significant obesity. And then the only one I could really find for childhood obesity was 2005, and this didn't include all children. It was children that were in the 10 to 17-year-old range. So you can see that we have a minimum of 20 to 25% obesity up to 35.1 to 40% obesity in our country for children in that age range. Okay, so this is really quite recent. I saw this on the news. You know, Michelle Obama is pretty strong into trying to prevent childhood obesity, and she's into, healthy eating and improving school lunches and that type of thing. And they were very happy to be able to report that there is a change in the data for 2 to 5-year-olds. And where they got the information from was a JAMA article that was done in 2014 that looked at obesity rates. It was all people, childhood and adult obesity rates in our country for 2011 to 2012. They had over 9,000 people that participated in the study. And what they found that with everybody except for the 2 to 5-year-olds, there really wasn't a significant change in the obesity rates between 2003 and 4 and 2011 and 12. But they did find in the 2 to 5-year-olds that there was a decline from 13.9%, which would be in that 2003-04 time period, and they went down to 8.4% in the last year that they did the study, so 11 and 12. I have some that are going to be later that will show that the year previous to 2002, it was not as high as the 13.9%. So I'll get to that in just a minute. Okay, so BMI, this is for adults, and really you all know what this is. So body mass index, you can look it up online. You don't have to know how to calculate it. And you know what the normal BMI ratings are. So I'm just going to go over that very quickly. The definition of normal, overweight, and obese. And I think that most of us probably would agree that that is not a perfect indicator of the fatness of a person, because we certainly have athletes that are going to be considered obese because, you know, muscle is heavier than fat. So it's not a perfect indicator. They don't do it the same way with children. The CDC goes by percentile rankings with children. So it's going to be gender and age specific, and they define overweight is excess body weight from fat, muscle, bone, and or water. So it's everything that's in your body. But they define obesity as just excess body fat. So that's going to be a little bit different. And then there is a calculator online that you can use on WebMD to figure out where a child is, and you do need to know their height and weight to do that. And they define overweight as being more than the 85th and less than the 95th percentile for their BMI, and obesity as being in greater than the 95th percentile for their BMI. There is a link between infants that gain too much weight in the first 6 months of their life and how heavy they're going to be later on. And that link isn't true for the second 6 months of life. So if they are gaining too much body fat in that first 6 months, they had a much higher likelihood of having a problem with obesity and metabolic syndrome later on in life. And I give the reference there, which was from the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. And of course, the problem almost always with all of us is going to be that you take too many calories in and don't spend enough calories on your physical activity. The problem with, especially when you work in pediatric physical therapy, is that the children we work with often have a specific disability, and those children are at greater risk for being obese. So I'm sure most of you have heard of people with Down syndrome, for example. Obesity is a problem. Muscular dystrophy, that's a problem. Spina bifida, that's a problem. Kids that are in a wheelchair for other reasons like cerebral palsy, all of that is going to be an issue because the energy expenditure is less. So they're more likely to become obese. Okay, so statistics for adults. In 1980, now they took overweight and obese together. So almost half of the population in 1980 was either overweight or obese. And of that portion, 15% were considered to be obese. In 2002, that increased to 65% for that whole category of overweight and obese, and the obesity rate doubled in that number of years. So 22 years, we doubled our obesity rate in adults. Between 1986 and 2000, those people that had BMIs of greater or equal to 40 increased from 1 in 200 to 1 in 50. So that was a fourfold increase. And there is prevalence by race, with African Americans having the highest percentage, 39%, the Hispanic population at 32%, and the Caucasian at 29%, and more females than males enter into the problem category. So for children and adolescents, in 1980 to 2010, now they didn't get specific with obesity. They just said the amount of children that were in the 6 to 11-year-old category who were overweight went up from 7% to 18%. So that's certainly 2.5-fold. 12 to 19-year-olds, they increased from 5% to 18%, so that's more than threefold. In 1994 to 2002, here's where the other statistics for 2 to 5-year-olds is. In 1994, it would have been 7%, and then it was 10% in 2002. So then in 2003, it went up to 13.9%, and in 11-12, it went down to 8.4%. So at least that age group is going in the right direction. And in 2010, more than a third of children and adolescents were either obese or overweight. And for that category of people, the children and adolescents that are 6 to 19, they didn't have the younger population. Again, we have differences by race. So we have 21% for African American, 22% for Hispanics, and 14% for Caucasian. And there's a much higher likelihood that somebody is going to have a problem with their weight if they are in a lower socioeconomic status. So below poverty levels are going to have the most problem. And if an adolescent is overweight, they're 70% more likely to be obese or overweight as adults. So it is a serious problem. It's going to not just go away. Okay, so what are the problems? One of the things that I saw just on watching the TV news, this is probably a couple years ago, is they showed a person that bought an older house that was in the 1940s, and the kitchen had not been remodeled. So they had the cupboards from that era. And the guy went to put his dishes away, and he couldn't close the cupboard doors. Why do you think that was? The dinner plates were too big. And you know what? I just inherited recently from, my mother's been gone for a couple decades, but I finally got her china. And the dinner plates, and this is what we would have used, were the size of our salad plates right now. They're about this big. And And we all know that if you put food on a smaller plate, the same amount of food on a smaller plate and a bigger plate, you think that you're not getting enough food on the bigger plate because it's not filled. And you'll just put more food on a bigger plate. So obviously we have changed our portion sizes very much because I think hardly any kitchens haven't been remodeled since 1940, but this guy really showed it. He couldn't close his cupboard doors, and he either had to buy just salad plates to be able to use his cupboards, or he has to remodel his kitchen. So obviously we are eating a lot more food than we did in the earlier part of the last century. Okay, so we all know there's huge problems with everything being high fat, processed, and a lot of sugar, right? So that is obviously the biggest problem. And as far as the socioeconomic status goes, we all know it costs a lot more money to eat healthy. To go in there and buy all the produce costs a lot more money than getting something that's in a can or whatever. It's just a lot of money. So that's probably why that group of people that are below poverty level have a bigger incidence of obesity. So obviously we have the supersized portions, and I thought this was interesting. A regular soft drink has about 10 teaspoons of sugar in it, and a supersized one has about 30 teaspoons of sugar in it. That's a lot. But even if you had the kid drink a sugar-free soda, which we probably all would have some type of argument about, first off, there's no nutrition at all. But just the carbonation itself is really, really bad. Kids are starting to get fractures that they didn't used to get. They're drinking less milk or something that's going to give them calcium, and they're drinking a lot more soda. And the soda is a problem because the carbonation mixes with, binds with the calcium from the bones. You get calcium carbonate, and you get osteopenia. So kids are starting to fracture a lot more. You'll see Colles fractures in kids, usually associate that with an older person, but not so with kids that have had way too much soda. Okay, so we'll continue on. So lack of physical activity, and we have this guy up here saying, what do you mean I have to pedal it? Everything is automated now. Everything's got a battery in it or something like that. And we really, really don't want to do the physical activity, or I won't say we, but in general, the population is not engaging in enough physical activity. So one of the problems, of course, is that we have technology, and people are sitting in front of computers or whatever and not really being active video games. They have really good CNR eminences, you know, from doing their video games, but they're not getting any cardio workouts or full body workouts. And then there's a ton of sitting when kids go to school. They sit in school almost all the day, and they have a lot of homework when they come home, and that's really hard to do unless you are sitting down. So that kind of breeds a sedentary lifestyle. A lot of parents use a TV as a babysitter because we have a lot of latchkey kids, and so that's they don't want them to be outside. They don't want to worry about them, and so who babysits them? It's the television. And what do kids do when they're watching television? They eat. So not only are they physically inactive, but they are also getting more calories. And a lot of parents, I know when I was a kid, and you could tell that I was older if I've been working well over 30 years as a PT, but my parents rang a bell when it was time for me to come home, and I might be a couple miles away, and kids would go out and get teams to do some type of ball game or something like that, unless it was, you know, pitch dark out or horrible out, you could go, you know. But these days people are afraid of everything under the sun, and so kids don't get that kind of freedom to just go in the neighborhood and play outside because parents are terrified of, you know, somebody abducting their child or something like that. So times have changed drastically. So here are just a few things where you can see that kids are inundated with sedentary activity from an early time. I even saw once on an EI, an early intervention goal, that the child would be able to sit. This is a pre-12-month-old child. The child would be able to sit and watch TV. You know, like, yeah, cringe, absolutely. That was, but, you know, that's where we're at. And if the parent wants them to be able to sit and watch TV in early intervention, you're supposed to do what the parent wants. So apparently it got rid of. I'm thinking, whoa, I think I'd have to talk to that parent. Okay, so what are the causes? So one of the problems are that parents that have kids that are overweight don't really perceive their child as being overweight. That's one of the issues. And this Dr. Levy did a survey, and he only found that less than 13% of the parents that had kids that were overweight actually identified them as being overweight. So that's a big problem. And they also found that less than a third associated that there would be a problem when their kid is overweight at the age they are now, and that they would be overweight as an adult. They didn't realize that there was a connection there. So it wasn't that important. You know, it's just a chubby kid that's baby fat, they'll wear it off, you know, whatever excuse, but they didn't identify it as being a problem. And then just like adults, kids have the same reasons for overeating. So coping with stress, so comfort eating, self-medication for depression and anxiety, and kids have that, which is very sad, and just because they're bored. So same excuses adults have, children have for overeating. And there is a genetic predisposition. So if you come from a family of obesity, your likelihood of being obese is going to be higher. Okay, so what's the impact on health? We know that 70 to 80% of adults that are obese do have diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, high cholesterol, and osteoarthritis. What about kids? Do they have any impact on their health? Indeed, they do. So 60% of kids that were 5 to 10 years old that were overweight or obese had at least one risk factor for cardiovascular disease, and they also had high blood pressure. Many kids have type 2 diabetes. That shouldn't happen. And nearly all of those kids were obese. That was certainly the cause for their diabetes. And their risks were higher with earlier onset of the disease. Just like with anybody, you're going to have more risk factors the sooner you have it. And obviously there's a connection with cardiovascular disease. And anybody that was born in the year 2000, they made this estimation that the risk of diabetes was 30% for boys and 40% for girls. So that's pretty high statistics. Okay. The obesity and overweight problems, mostly the obesity, are going to be multi-system problems. So they're also going to have a problem with respiratory system, and that would include asthma, exercise intolerance, and sleep apnea. They have an increased risk for cancer, and they have an increased risk for osteoarthritis. As far as the musculoskeletal system goes, there is definitely an increased risk for developing flipped capital femoral epiphysis, for increased fractures, because kids that are obese actually have osteopenia. Their bone density doesn't keep up with their weight. It seems a little counterintuitive, but that's what actually happens. There's an increased incidence of ganu valgus, so they're loading wrong with their knee, and tibia varum, so they have that problem as well. And there's also neuromuscularly, there's a decrease in balance. And in 8 to 13-year-olds that were obese, they found that there are differences in gait patterns when they compared them with healthy weight children, including a decreased cadence and velocity in their gait, too much energy expenditure. So as soon as it's too much energy expenditure to engage in something, what do people do? They too hard, not going to do it. Some of them complain of foot discomfort, and if they have the valgus, the ganu valgus, then they're going to probably have even more foot pain. They end up getting arthritis in their knee way too young because of that abnormal knee loading. They get greater problems with injury because of repetitive loading tasks, because it's too much weight for their joints to handle. And they just don't want to be physically active. And they also found that in 12 to 18-year-olds that were obese, that their functional balance was decreased. And here is a study that was done last year in the Pediatric Physical Therapy Journal. There are some limitations to this study, I think. But what they did was they took 70 children that were 5 to 9 years old. So this is a little bit different category than what I just talked about. And 29 of them were overweight or obese. And they didn't differentiate. They were just in the category of overweight or obese. So I think that's where the limitation for this study is. And they had 41 that were healthy weight. And they didn't find any difference in the gait parameters with this group of overweight and obese. But I think what maybe could have happened is that some of the kids that were considered overweight might have been a little more athletic and maybe a little bit more muscular. I think that probably tainted this a little bit. But they did find that their balance was decreased, so they're looking at one-leg balance. And then they only measured strength by hand grip, and they found no difference with that. So I think I might argue that maybe just hand grip strength might not be the best measure. So there were some, issues with limitations with this study, but they did find a balance difference. And then 2 years ago in the same journal, they were looking at different weight statuses and the gross motor ability of kindergartners. And they did a national representative sample of over 4,600 children, and they put them into categories based on the CDC criteria. So they were either going to be underweight, healthy weight, overweight, or obese. So they were very specific. So this was a little bit better. And they tested them using the revised early screening inventory to determine their gross motor abilities. And they found that the children who were obese did indeed have decreased locomotor skills. Particularly, they found jumping, hopping, and walking backwards as being an impaired area. And their balance skills were also decreased. Interestingly, the underweight kids also had problems with hopping and balancing, and that could be that they just were so non-muscular that they, had some issues. And what they concluded in this was, and this sounds a little off too, is that we need to adjust our gross motor expectations for young obese kids. However, and this was what they said in the journal, however, so you're not going to expect them to do the same, but you want to promote them to get up to the level that they should be at. So I'm going to say that as physical therapists, we're not going to accept that we just have to dumb it down, but to realize that there is going to be a difference. And I work in the schools, and sometimes the only reason the kid can't do it is because they're fat. Well, that's actually becoming an actual category of disability now. And I think, how do we know what comes first, too? You have, is the kid not active because they don't have the ability and so they become heavier, or is it the other way around? And it's a little hard to tease that out, but maybe they have some underlying physical problems before all of that kind of predispose them to maybe being less physically engaged because it was hard for them to start with. So I think that there are some things that we still need to learn and work out in this area, because I just don't think we know everything we need to know yet. Okay, so obviously they're going to have psychosocial problems, a lot of low self-esteem. Some kids are depressed, anxious. And they did a study where they surveyed 8 to 12-year-olds that were obese, and they asked them about their quality of life. And what they found is that they were very profoundly impaired in this area, and actually equivalent to kids that did the same survey that were undergoing chemotherapy. That's how they viewed their quality of life, very, very low. So their quality of life, according to them, is not good. Attendance tends to be lower, so that's going to impact their ability to learn. So that's one issue. And then other evidence that links their weight and their ability to learn is that they had kids that were overweight had significantly lower test scores in math and reading, and this was a study of over 11,000 children. They found that overweight adolescent girls were more likely to be held back or be a poor student. And we know that physical activity is critically important, not just for good health, but it's also important for learning. And this is where I'm going to make the links to learning and cognitive abilities. And there is a lot of evidence to support that. So in 2006, they did a longitudinal study. I think it was over a 4-year period of time, all on third graders, so 12,600 kids in 1,000 different schools. So this would be a national sample. And they found that if they increased the physical activity levels in the kids, their scores on reading and math went up. Kids that were overweight had lower scores, and if they were above poverty level, so it also shows the socioeconomic status, that they also had better scores. Then they did, in 2003, they did a functional MRI study that showed that there is definitely a cognitive connection in the brain with movement structures, especially the cerebellum, and that had to do with memory, attention, and things like that. And we know from motor learning theory that we do use cognitive abilities to anticipate movement, even if it's at a subconscious level. So there is a connection. Before we do a movement, we have to kind of figure out what it is we are going to do, especially if it's going to be a sequential movement or a more complicated movement. We kind of figure out how we're going to do that, set our goals, figure out what kind of variables there might be, and have to be able to adjust. So there's this little bit of cognitive forethought before we even start the movement. So there's that connection. And then in the 90s, they had all sorts of links between movement and physical activity and various parts of the brain that have to do with learning. So they found connections with movement and vision. They found connections between movement and language. You must see this, Jean. Absolutely. Sometimes the first time a kid talks is when they're in physical therapy, or they get a vocalization because the movement produces that, or they start to understand a concept because they're jumping maybe over or under something, and then they get a connection and they understand the language concept that they don't get when they're just sitting down in a chair. Movement and attention, there's correlation there. And then in 2002, they did a study and found out that people that exercise actually have greater cortical mass. And they've also more recently found, and I don't deal with adults, but I think I am one, so I'm interested in that, and in the correlation with Alzheimer's. And the only real evidence out there that can help in that area is physical exercise. You know, there's an awful lot of industry out there that wants to have us buy cognitive games and that type of stuff. And I don't think at this point they have found any connection that actually works, but they have definitely found that physical exercise works. I'm not saying you shouldn't do those types of cognitive exercises, but exercise absolutely has been found to be beneficial. Okay, so lots of impact on education if physical activity is there. Improves attention, focus, concentration, balance, self-esteem, the behavior improves, conflict resolution, handwriting improves, spatial skills improve, creativity, imagination, teamwork, eye movement, problem solving, energy levels, relationships, movement control. So there are a lot of connections between physical activity and improvement of the child to learn and function in society. So what can we do? Obviously, we want to promote good nutrition and portion control. And the whole recommendation is that kids have to have at least 60 minutes a day of exercise. And it probably isn't happening, but that's the goal. So different kinds of activities that kids can be involved in. But kids that aren't involved in sports probably are very unlikely to get to 60 minutes a day of physical exercise in. And a lot of schools outside of our state don't even have physical education. It's not required by law in every single state in our country. New York State, it is required. That's a good thing about our state. So parents have a huge impact. This is an area that I'm interested in because working with babies is a lot of fun, but a lot of people are using the baby carriers instead of carrying their child. Do you think there's a difference in how much motor activity a child has to do if they're sitting in a carrier seat versus if they're being held by their parent? There's a huge difference. They have to make all sorts of adjustments because as you move, the baby has to adjust. And they have a lot of sensory needs, too. So they really need to get out of the top mode here of being carried around. And I think we also have a lot of parents that end up getting musculoskeletal issues from doing all of that carrying, too. So how they're being transported and just the interaction. It seems in not all families, but some families that just put the baby in something and keep them quiet, and everybody's going to be happy because, you know, I worked all day and I'm tired and I really don't want to do anything. So put the baby in something and keep them quiet, but rather than interacting with them. But they really need to have that interaction with the parent and allowing that baby to move from an early age. And we know from the whole back to sleep thing that there's a whole problem with kids not tolerating being on their tummies. And if they're not on their tummies, they don't learn to move very well. So we really want to be promoting that, certainly as physical therapists. So activity, activity, activity. That's what we are wanting to promote. and not having just toys that are automated. You know, just plain old-fashioned toys. You got to pedal them, you got to stack them, you got to, you know, you have to move in order for them to be fun. And then there were a couple of CDC maps that talked about physical activity levels, and they showed 2005 and 2007. So the activity levels in the dark blue would be more than 55%. I don't know how well you can see that. But the physical activity levels for the orange are more than 40 and up to 45%. So the best ones are the dark blue ones, where they're having the most physical activity. And that actually has improved in those particular two maps. So we're going in the right direction. And then as far as schools go, you know, we have a whole issue of kids are in school all day long. We have the No Child Left Behind, and now we have the Common Core standards. And what does that do? That puts all the pressure on improving academic skills, because we have lots of standardized tests that kids have to pass. And that puts a lot of pressure on the educators as well as the kids. And so a lot of times what they'll do, the schools will opt for, we got to get it done, just teach the academics only, because they got to improve those test scores. And they're not realizing that physical activity actually is linked to learning. And so we need to give those kids movement breaks, and we need to look at the whole child. And so that's going to include their health as well as engaging in physical activity, phys ed, recess, that type of thing. So as a physical therapist, we always will advocate that they need to have movement in the classroom. So they need to have movement breaks. And we know this for sure for the kids that we see in physical therapy, that they need it. But all kids need to have movement breaks. Just like I think a lot of people here are probably getting tired and would like to stand up, because what does sitting down do? It makes you logy, right? So your alert level goes down. So you want them to be alert and paying attention, let them move. So some of the things, some places may have the money to be able to use some type of therapy ball to sit on, or sometimes there's just, you know, the discs you can sit on. But even just getting up and doing chair push-ups or desk push-ups or wall push-ups or squeezing Play-Doh, doing anything. So you just have to be creative in trying to figure out things to recommend. Drama and role plays. Instead of just doing review games, have it be a ball toss game. Something that is going to incorporate movement. Let the kids do a dance to lyrics that they make up for something that they learned in science or history or whatever their lesson is. So that's an area for school PTs that is a challenge, because the kids need to learn the academic stuff, but maybe we can be the pioneers that will help them to incorporate movement so that they actually do better in school and they're more physically fit. We're an advocate for daily recess for the younger kids. Obviously, that doesn't happen once they get to high school. But what happens definitely in schools that I've been in is that if the kid is naughty, recess gets taken away. And it apparently happens with Jean as well. Oh, yes. So what do we say? Do not take recess away as a punishment. If they're going to be punished, okay, they might not be able to play with the kids on the playground, but they are going to walk for 30 minutes. You need to walk. You need to do something. You need to move. You might not be able to have as much fun as everybody else, but let's still have the physical activity. So I've got a walking program going where I am. The kids will walk the entire time. Sometimes they don't get to go outside. Sometimes they have to walk the halls. And that means that whoever the teaching assistant is with them also gets some good exercise. So that's one thing. Obviously, physical education is critical, and we don't have to worry about that in this state because it does occur. And incorporating nutrition and health information into the curriculum at every single grade level. Don't wait until the kid is, I don't know when they put it in, 7th or 8th grade, to start talking about nutrition and health. They need to learn about it much earlier than that. Okay, so parents and families also have an important role. They need to exercise together as a family. And I heard Kevin and Carrie talking about skiing with their family, so that's a wonderful activity. Limiting TV and computer time, healthy meals instead of junk food meals, and don't reward the kid by going to McDonald's. It would be better to maybe teach them how to be part of making a healthy meal. I used to do that with my kids in the summertime when I had more time. They had to figure out the menu. We had to go to the store. I had to supervise them so they didn't chop their fingers off, but they made one meal each a week. And so they learned about food. And they also got a coupon from me so they could get some kind of prize at the end of summer because they participated in what I required them to do. I am not opposed to bribery. Okay, and then parents also are role models, so they have to show the kids the right thing to do. You know, kids are very much imitators, so if the parent says, I'm eating the fries, but you need to eat celery, that's just not going to go over. So obviously they need to be good role models. And so here's the take-home message, that academics improve with physical activity and good nutrition, and that healthy, physically fit children learn better and are better equipped to become contributing members of society.